this video, I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about space privatization and settler colonialism. I really think that you should be preparing for settler colonialism as it could show up on the affirmative as the negative against whether you're reading a policy argument or a critical argument, because I really think that this criticism has so much to say about the idea of spatialization, so much to say about like the way in which we kind of like the reasons why we desire to go to space, what that means for our relationship to humanity, what that means for histories of colonialism and how they replete themselves in other places. And so I definitely think that kind of like tuning into the series can be really helpful in terms of figuring out what are some of the core arguments that are going to show up on the resolution for next month. And I think that being able to kind of like look at the ways that settler colonialism shows up as one of the like innate questions that like kind of like cover things like the public-private divide, like our ideas about space exploration, etc. in the resolution, is important to get a good look at all the different ways you can critique various parts of the resolution. And I think that being able to just theorize ways that you can answer this argument or read this argument is just really important to the development of how like different debates are going to go on this resolution. And so hopefully if you haven't already, you've watched the last video, or you're going to watch the last video that I just did, kind of like starting the conversation about how to answer these affirmatives, because in that video I kind of start off by thinking about like what are some of the priorities and ways that we can kind of group the type of affirmatives that could be read and the ways in which you can respond to them with different case arguments, framework arguments, T arguments. And I really want to continue like that conversation in this video as we begin to talk about how they relate to like criticisms, counterplans, and disads, which is something that I want to cover because I definitely think they all have different types of interactions with just the way that you're thinking about these type of arguments as a whole. And hopefully this kind of video is helpful in like covering the basis for all that. When we're starting on criticisms, I'm going to start with like how we're thinking about the context of like indigenous futurism affirmatives, which is like one of the types of affirmatives that I said might be seen on this types of resolution that I've been talking about as one of the styles of affirmatives that I think are really endemic to the type of question that's being asked about space. Is that I think that when you're trying to figure out how to answer this from a K perspective, yes, a lot of your anti-futurism arguments work, but I feel like a lot of the arguments that are normatively made against anti-futurism aren't in the context of like what that kind of futurism will look like if not under a Western like white mythologic frame. And so I think that you need like arguments about like the ways in which it's not just a question of like who controls the future, but rather the future as like something that we should desire as a political telos, and the idea that kind of like sees in the future as something like politically revolutionary innately as something that is like bad. And I think you need to make arguments about like why futurisms presuppose ideas about like how we think about reproductive capacity, how we think about like the idea of being able to maintain certain like institutions like the family, etc., that create the continuance of human existence, and the way that those things get exported into like different places like such as our conversations about space and like our relationships to science, technology in the future. I think that being able to like really push the button on like how these different questions are kind of like challenging the way in which indigenous futurism is able to like speak of itself as innately good because of the way in which it's non-Western centric, allows you to make a lot of arguments about like how intercommunal violence can be produced by our over romanticization of like what is possible in the future, and like requires us to tune into the ways in which we produce and like contribute to those forms of violence actively all around us, and being able to use that as kind of like a paradigm for how you're able to like analyze the difference between whatever alternative you're reading and the affirmative. I think that being able to then like make the basis of maybe for other arguments about like why the over kind of like fantasization of the future actually like sanitizes our ability to think about what action can be pragmatic in the present, could stop our ability from being able to access like material instantiations of like stopping material structures as they operate on a day-to-day basis. And I think that kind of like is another lens in which you could critique the relationship to just like material praxis that a lot of these affirmatives take up and kind of mess with like what they usually will rely on in terms of solvency to like make this argument make sense in the context of material praxis, all of which I think is like really important like lessons for how you're able to think about like what like arguments you really want to kind of like isolate here. I then think that when you kind of like move on from that and go into like questions of how you would make criticisms viable against like the more refusal kind of like incommensurability forces of the resolution, is I think that you really just need to like indict like their kind of like refusal to think about ideas of like mutual debt, of mutual solidarity and vulnerability in the context of like the current world that we live in. I feel like a lot of the argument that is kind of like being made is that there shouldn't have to be like a burden that is like bared by indigenous folk to be able to respond to like a crisis that is created under like settler colonialism and genocide. And I feel like the argument that you need to be pushing from whatever type of criticism that you want to make is that mutual vulnerability can be made by like the mutual like understanding that it's not a question that it's not just a question of like what it is to have shared responsibility, but like what it means to be in debt to those that like are marginalized by the way in which like we're able to constantly live our lives, and being able to begin to question like how these types of questions of incommensurability and refusal are good as like normative responses responses to that resolution, but don't really respond to the textures of like how like these communities relate to others around them, and also don't create a way of being able to theorize those things texturally because of the way in which they refuse the paradigm of being able to maybe not produce an affirmative answer, but at least a discussion about the ways in which we kind of like invest in those various forces of like colonialism and violence, all of which I think is really important to kind of like discussing like what their kind of like theory of power is like bringing to bear. And so I think that either you really need a good critique of just like their kind of like theory and historization of colonization, or you need a really good criticism of like the ways in which they're kind of like thinking about like solely a negative response to the basis of the resolution. I then think that when you start moving on to places like the counterplan and the disad debate, a lot of the arguments that I think you really need to be pushing are about like why that for a lot of this uniqueness stuff that we were talking about in the last video, for like why the kind of like question of space privatization is so prevalent to like the impacts that kind of like threaten human life at an existential level on an everyday basis. I think that making arguments about like how the kind of like impact framing that needs to be taken up is one that is able to respond to the inevitability of there being a race or drive to space, regardless of whether or not the 1AC itself invests in that. And so it becomes a question of like what we do with that thing, and can it either accelerate us closer towards like human extinction, or can we like do something to kind of like save the ways in which we kind of like constitute value in the status quo. And I think that being able to kind of like push a lot of those questions as like relevant to why the counterplan and disad put a big emphasis on legal details and other ways of thinking about our relationship to the law as kind of like uses of an alternative futurism to the affirmative, or as an alternative way of just thinking about how we relate to the question of space, and a dichotomy between private and public can be really important. As I've kind of said in other places when answering this criticism on this resolution, kind of like beating into like the judge's mind that there is a kind of like moral difference between the usage of like privatized space for like individual like benefit and good, and the way in which, even if imperfect, public uses of space kind of create the possibility for like living a life that is different than the one that we do now. I think that being able to like really push that question as central to how they're thinking about the world of the counterplan and disad versus the world of the AF really pushes the affirmative to either be able to resolve some of these impacts, which is a material basis that you can then create more arguments off of on the case or other solvency deficits and stuff like that, or it kind of creates the basis for you to just kind of like have it all on the impact comparison debate, which I think could be helpful depending on how you really want to frame the conversation. Hopefully the video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing with space colonization and settler colonialism and all types of stuff. And yeah, thank you as always for watching.